Between 17th and 19th centuries, Kyrgyz people were having a difficult time, first under the pressure of Jungar invaders, later under the Khanat of Khakan. In times of trouble, the battle with invading Kazakh sultans and tribal strife within the community made Kyrgyz people less forceful. Making use of this hard time, Tsarist Russia eventually colonized Kyrgyz land. From the second half of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, there was a lot of pressure on Kyrgyz people. Significant changes in power structure were made, and ruling tops like Manap and Beys lost their power. Parish government and foremen depended on elected colony tops came to power, and weak judges who were incapable of detecting major crimes were appointed. However, among them, there were noble rulers who had public authority, and they led illiterate people to keep pace with time. One of these historical personalities is Kanaat Khan, the last influential ruler, the first educator, and the leader of the battle for freedom. Kanaat Khan was a hereditary ruler. His ancestors were great leaders who reigned over people. If we look at the line of his descent, his forefather was Taghay, the right wing of Kyrgyz people descends from him. Taghay's son was Kılcır. Kılcır's son was Dolos's son was Manap's son was Sutoy. Sutoy's son was Uçuke. Uçuke's son was Mamatkul's son was Temir's son was Çerekçi's son was Abayılda's son was Ibike's son was Kanaat. A lot of information can be found where positive feedback was given to his father, Ibike Manap. According to some historical data, Ibike is said to be a great man who took part in the conflicts between Bugu and Sarbaghish tribes in the 1850s. In one of those conflicts, when two sides were fighting in a duel, Ibike and Bekten Manap attacked each other with a battle axe, which caused a lot of damage. Balbay Batır witnessed everything and said that they were true sons of Kılcır. So these facts suggest that in the second half of the 19th century, Ibike Manap was active in the political life of the Kyrgyz people. If we consider another event when second cousins from Çerekçi tribe, led by Urkunçu Manap, attacked Ibike and killed him. According to Kyrgyz customs, retribution was demanded. Shabdan Batır interfered in punishing the offenders, and other beys decided that 9 heads of 3 different cattle and 2 girls should have been given as retribution. Shabdan Batır gave the floor to Kanaat to show his judgment. It took Kanaat a few minutes to think over this matter and called those girls and freed them, not to have them ridiculed by others as female slaves, and refused to get the cattle. By settling the complicated matter this way, he calmed down people. Later, Kanaat was elected as Bolush of Abayılda, and since 1885, he served the Tsarist colonial government. In the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, Russian Tuzem schools in Pishbek, Tokmok, and Karakol were opened, and mostly children of migrated Russians and Ukrainians studied. They had to teach some children to have them as interpreters for locals. That time, Muslim Tatar and Bashkir educators living in the central part of Russia used new methods of teaching and spread education. The newer form of education reached Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan, but it needed to be supported by influential persons among local people. Otherwise, it would have been difficult to provide education in a strange area. Great leaders were well aware of the importance of novelty and ready to accomplish it with a great effort of will and sparing their wealth.
Kanaat
was influential not only in Kochkor Valley, but also in Turkestan, and had a close relationship with prominent intellectuals of that part. The fact that he sent his son İshak Kanaat to Galia Madrasa in Ufa proves his network. In that madrasa, together with İshak Kanaat A few fellows like Ishenali Rabayev, Nadir Kulabirov, and Jaqib got an education there. They weren't busy with just studying, but they also started writing their books. For example, in 1911, Ishenali Rabayev and another Kazakh educator, Sarsekeyev, wrote a book called Alif Bey. A book by Moldo Kılıç, the writing poet of that time, was published with the support of young Kyrgyz people. Kanaat Abdыкadыр founded a modern school teaching innovatively in 1912. Manaps, leading rulers of that time, weren't busy with acquiring wealth, but they started building schools in different places to promote and educate people. It can be estimated as a movement worth appreciation because first Shabdan Jantay Ulu, then Kanaat Abdыкadır, later in Akhtala, Kalpahaji, opened schools. A lot of schools were opened in Issyk. In other words, there were more than 100 innovative schools founded in Turkestan. It was proved that more than 30 schools were opened in Kyrgyzstan. The fact that Kanaat Abdыкadır and others had opened schools proves their close relationship with prominent intellectuals of Turkestan. Before mullahs were invited to gain knowledge in yurts, in the beginning of the 20th century, special structures were established where except Quran and theology general education was provided. Subjects like geography, mathematics, geometry, history, languages, and literature were taught. The school of Kanaat Abdыкadır was built of bricks. The roof was of iron, and educated persons of that time like Ishaq Kanatulu and Jarqambay Mullah taught there. Information may be found in the Muslim press like Ayqap, released in Kazakhstan, and the newspaper like Terjimen by Ismail Gaspiral Ulu. These mass media spread to regions of Kyrgyzstan. This information became clear in later mass media. The spread of mass media means that people of that time were literate. If they had been illiterate, they wouldn't have collected those newspapers and books. From this, we can say that literate people were getting more and more. Information saying that Kanaat Abdыкadır opened his school for 5,000-6,000 soms appeared in the newspaper Ayqap. By modern standards, this sum seems small, but that time it was a large sum. As you know, that time a sheep cost 50 to 60 tiyins. Kanaat Abdыкadır didn't just open a school, but also provided teachers and paid them salaries. He built a dormitory of the school as well. Children from distant areas would stay there. Parents of studying children paid some amount of money, but we can see information that capable children of families in need were taught for free of charge. Sabir Gabdilmanov was a Tatar teacher in an innovative school in Karakol. Sabir Gabdilmanov mentioned him and the school founded by him, Hospitality of the Village People of Kanaat, in his book Travel to Tianshan Mountains. He wondered how people cherish traditions, and he did his best to learn all of them. Such pieces of information prove the friendly relationship of the educators of that time. Kanaat Abdыкadır's son Ishaq was one of those educators who gained knowledge and shared it with others. The popular folklorist Bashkir scholar who collected folk and started putting Manas epic down, Qayyum Miftakov, wrote in his autobiography that he studied together with the sons of Kanaat Abdыкadır in Madrasa Galia. He wrote in his memoirs that he studied with the sons of Kanaat, and when he was excluded from many things for participating in the strike when he was hungry, Kanaat's sons helped him. He also noted with regret that after 1916, he came to Kyrgyzstan with the purpose to do a lot in collecting folklore with the help of Kanaat's sons. Unfortunately, Ishaq Kanatov had been hanged for his participation in the national uprising of 1916. When the National Liberation Uprising broke out in 1916, many enlighteners opposed the uprising because they knew the power of the Russian Empire and the dangers it posed. Kanaat Abdыкadır, Shabdan's sons, Kemal Shabdanov, didn't want people to take part in the strike. There was a danger that the people would perish. However, after the uprising of the people, who did not tolerate the wrong colonial policy, the leaders of the people, the enlighteners, tried to lead the uprising despite their threats. This ended in tragedy, But most of these enlighteners continued their activities after the October Revolution. The beautifully built madrasa of Kanaat Khan was destroyed by Russian troops in 1916 during the National Liberation Uprising. During the revolt in 1916, as Kanaat was religious, he gathered mullahs to discuss it at board level. In the result, they decided to fight in a war for a just cause. After this decision was made, Kanaat Bolush gathered the people of Abayilda and Temirbolot in Akbel to have a meeting. In that meeting, Kanaat was appointed as Khan. When Kanaat Khan and his 2,000-strong army crossed the Chui Valley on August 13, he was proclaimed the Khan for the second time when they reached the outskirts of Tokmok. It was an ancestral tradition. During such a war, the Kyrgyz declared their commander-in-chief Khan. This was not the Khan who was the head of the state. About a dozen Khans were proclaimed commanders in the areas of uprising, of which Kanaat Khan twice held the rank of Khan. After this proclamation as a Khan in the Chui Valley, he was increasingly active in capturing city of Tokmok. Soldiers from different vilayets of the city Tokmok joined 2,000 soldiers of Kanaat Khan, and there were 5,000 altogether. With these soldiers, he captured the villages of Pokrovka and Ivanovka in the outskirts of Tokmok. The rebels kept attacking the town of Tokmok for about 10 days. The tactics of the nomads were used to some extent by Kanaat Khan in this attack. The attack on Tokmok was carried out in 3 directions. The middle group of these 3 groups was led by Kanaat Khan himself. He prepared a special letter to the representatives of the colonial authorities in Tokmok, in which he stated that our forces are strong enough to capture Tokmok, give in voluntarily, and liberate the city. However, who defended the city had killed a diplomat. The rebels intensified their attacks. On August 20 to 22, punitive troops with additional artillery and machine guns arrived from Verny and Tashkent. Historical records show that only 5/10 of the rebels had rifles, swords, and spears. Unable to withstand the heavily armed retaliatory forces, the rebels had to leave the town of Tokmok and retreat to Khochkhor. Regional governments in the eastern part of Khochkhor arose, and rebels led by Tulku Ulu Tezekbay and Shirai Ulu Dolotkul imposed a blockade for several days and invaded the village of Stalipin, present Khochkhor village. People living in the eastern part of Jungal region, under the leader Chine Ulu Kokumbay, invaded Beladzarsky village, located in the present Khuyruchuk village, where migrated Russians were living. Rebels consisting of 5,000 equestrians imposed a blockade around Tokmok for 9 days from 13 to 22nd August and had to retreat when additional force came from Pishpek and Verny on August 22nd. When soldiers were coming from Tashkent, people who rebelled around Tokmok retreated to Khochkhor. The burned bridge in the northwestern part of Khochkhor village that was preserved to our days is the memorial from the disaster caused in 1916. The bridge, built over the fast-flowing river of that time, was burned by people who were escaping from Chui Valley to halt Russian soldiers. In September, Kanaat Khan with his equestrian squad consisting of 700 soldiers fought against fully armed with automatic rifles of Colonel Slinko in the lowland of Karakol, lost the battle and retreated. Then, when they were shooting in Karakol, the troops led from Tashkent by Colonel Babarov opened fire from Khazar. The soldiers of Kanaat Khan suffered a lot between 2 fires. After this event, his troops disintegrated. At the end of September, there was a mass exodus of people to China. Colonel Slinko, with the help of Kurman Lepesov and his son Isak, arrested Kanaat Khan and took him first to Pishpek, then to Verny. The uprising in the Khochkhor Valley did not last long. Following the uprising, the Russian administration sent punitive squads. The Kyrgyz had to retreat when they heard that troops were coming, especially since the news came that Russian troops had crossed the Kogat Pass into the Kochkor Valley and arrived at Togostoro. And there were many reports from the representatives of the Sayak tribes on Togostoro and Jumgal sides. Even Kokumbai Bolush with his people, who were actively involved in the uprising in Jumgal, came to Kochkor. Seeing this, the Esengul people in the eastern part of Kochkor joined the people of Jumgal and moved out through Karakojur, crossed the Bedel Pass and the Chinese border, and migrated towards Akchi and Kakshal. The Cherik tribe on the west of Kochkor could not escape. Most of them fled to the high mountains towards Sook and Karakol. Kurman Lepesov promised to find his son Ishaq Kanaat when it was demanded from him by Russians. He caught up with Kanaat Khan, who was on his way to China, and said, "If you leave, the whole nation will perish. If you come with your will, people will be pardoned." He thought, what is the sense of saving my soul when all people suffer? And came back to the Russians to be arrested. Most of the people who went to Sook and Karakol were killed by Russian detachments. The tombs in which corpses of those who died at that time were buried later give us proof. When they came to Ortok, there was dust coming from the side of Khazar. They thought that it was because Kokumbai's army was coming, but it was Selenko's detachment coming from Tashkent via Ketmentobe. There was a bloody battle, and people fled to Sarala Saz and Akbel. Well-armed Russian cavalry chased after them, and there was a horrible massacre. I met a man named Abakir who witnessed the incident. He said, "I was a 12-year-old boy at the time. I galloped across the mountainside while my mother galloped the horse towards the ravine. The Russians, on the other hand, rode at full speed on the edge of the mountain and began firing those who were in the ravine. I saw my mother shot down there. I saw her fall off her horse and lie down under a rock. Then I didn't know what happened to my mother. Later, I learned what had happened then. Mass murder turned out to have taken place." Historians and scholars have been studying the biography of Kanaat Khan and his role in the history of the Kyrgyz people, relying on historical sources. While studying the history of the uprising of 1916, I carried out research work in several state archives, including the archives of our capital city Bishkek, Almaty, Tashkent, and Moscow, and came across a very important document. According to the information from the State Central Archives of Tashkent in Uzbekistan, after Kanaat Khan was arrested, he was questioned in Verny. The original transcript of the interrogation in Verny was sent from Verny by the military governor of the Semirechye region to the governor of the Turkestan Krai in Tashkent. This protocol was confirmed and sealed by the State Archives of the Republic of Uzbekistan. Let me explain this protocol in more detail. When the 1916 uprising was almost suppressed, Kanaat Khan fell into the hands of the persecutors, and the Kyrgyz people were frightened and retreated to China. This happened in mid-October 1916, after which Kanaat Khan was sent to Verny, the capital of Semirechye region, where he was interrogated 3 times in prison in Verny. The first interrogation was conducted by Volkov on November 5, and it was translated by Burnashov. During interrogation, he boldly described the main causes and effects of the 1916 uprising, establishing many facts. He declared that the Kyrgyz people had risen up against the Tsarist government in pursuit of their sovereignty and independence. Kyrgyz people had a perfect pretext for the uprising when the draft of the conscription was issued by the Tsar of the Russian Empire, Emperor Nicholas II. He confirmed that the uprising sparked off as the Kyrgyz were against that issue. He was interrogated on November 20 the second time. The interrogator was Zheleznyakov, and the translator was Jainakov. During the interrogation, Kanaat Khan gave a very detailed explanation of the reasons for the uprising. Kanaat Khan, who had a great understanding of the life of the people, highlighted the colonial oppression of the Kyrgyz by the Russian Empire at that time. During the interrogation, he noted that the main cause for the uprising was the wrong land policy implemented in the territory of Kyrgyzstan from 1855 to 1916 by the Tsarist government. He explained in detail how the Kyrgyz lost their lands and how the foreigners occupied them because of this land policy. He presented concrete facts that complete dominance in forests and water resources had been achieved by foreigners, that assessing these forests, preparing firewood, and managing water sources had been controlled by them, and pasture utilization had become problematic for locals. The colonial authorities declared all the lands to be the property of the empire, resumed leasing them to former Kyrgyz landowners. Rich agricultural land was allotted to foreigners, and the local Kyrgyz were driven to the mountains under the pretext that they were the people who raised livestock. Well-known historians who studied the history of the 1916 in depth used the interrogation of Kanaat Khan in their investigations. It was also published in the monograph by Kushbek Usembayev in 1967. Subsequent scholars have also used the information provided by the same Kanaat Khan in the investigation, and I still use the information in the protocol of Kanaat Khan in my research. Widespread rebellion in 1916 and revolt caused a lot of casualties, and according to historical data, more than 150,000 persons became its victim. Kanaat Khan's son Ishaq, who finished Madrasa Galia and was busy with educating, was executed in Akterek of Ton region. His son Japar Sadiq, who was studying in gymnasium, was shot in the hill in Chuy Oblast. The decree on the execution of Kanaat Khan was adopted in Verny, and he was killed at age 53 in February 1917. His body was asked and buried by the local Kazakh people. Later, Ishinali Arabayev marked the tomb of Kanaat Khan, shown by Kazakhs, but sudden death of Ishinali Arabayev made this tomb unknown. Kanaat Abdыкadыр faced a terrible ordeal, and deliberate cruelty was inflicted on his descendants. His elder son Qarabay and the young writing poet Mambet Sadiq became the victims of that regime. His cousin, the first Kyrgyz historian Osmanali Siddiqov, was forced to flee to China. Information about Kanaat Khan and his activities have long been widely mentioned by scholars in history, and now books and folklore have been published. Scientific historians are reviving their efforts to study this topic in detail. Taking into consideration these actions, historical significance of Kanaat Khan and his time should be properly assessed.